You close the door on your way out. Thank you. Okay, so a concept that I think is very familiar to us and is very relevant to today is that always the question of leadership. Who are our leaders? Who is worthy to become a leader? Who becomes the leadership? And I think this is something everybody certainly thinks about a tremendous amount. Now, if we look in the Rambam, which you have in front of you, in source number 1, I'll come back to the picture later. The Rambam, when he talks about Hanukkah, these are the background. I think much of what he's saying you're familiar with. He says, in the era of the Second Temple, the Greek kingdom issued decrees against the Jewish people, attempting to nullify their faith, refusing to allow them to observe Torah and its commandments. They extended their hands against their property and their daughters. They entered the sanctuary, wrought havoc within, and made the sacraments impure. The Jews suffered greatly from them, for they oppressed them greatly until the God of our ancestors had mercy upon them, delivered them from their hands, and saved them. The sons of the Hasmoneans, the high priests, overcame them, slew them, and saved the Jews from their hand. They appointed a king from the priests, and sovereignty returned to Israel for more than 200 years until the destruction of the Second Temple. When the Jews overcame their enemies and destroyed them, they entered the sanctuary, which was the 25th of Kislev. They could not find any pure oil in the sanctuary, with the exception of the single cruse. It contained enough oil to burn for merely 1 day. They lit the arrangement of the candles from it for 8 days until they could crush olives and produce pure oil. Accordingly, turn the page, the sages of the generation ordained that these 8 days, which begin on the 25th of Kislev, should be commemorated to be days of happiness and praise of God. Candles should be lit in the evening at the entrance to the houses on each and every one of these 8 nights to publicize and reveal the miracle. These days are called Hanukkah. It is forbidden to eulogize and fast on them as on the days of Purim. Lighting the candles on these days is a rabbinic mitzvah like the reading of the Megillah. Okay, so nothing there is sort of new. This is your summary of why is there Hanukkah, what are we celebrating? But the issue that I want to zero in on is how does Rambam view the Hasmoneans, which you have over there like the first halacha. How does Rambam view the Hasmoneans? He views them as leaders. Does he view them as positive, negative, neutral? Yes, he views them as heroes. He views them as the right people at the right time, right? You see that sentence? The sons of the Hasmoneans, the high priests, overcame them, slew them, saved the Jews from the hand. They appointed a king from the priests, and the sovereignty was there for over 200 years. So according to Rambam, that also gives you the feeling that there's a stability there. That's right, 200 years is a long reign. And what would that seem to indicate? The fact that there is that stability?
They were doing the right thing.
Yeah, that would seem to indicate that they were doing the right thing. That has the continuation. And he seems to view them in a very positive way. It seems to be also that the importance of the leadership is that the leadership allowed the Jews to practice Torah. That getting rid of the Greeks and putting the Hasmoneans in their place is what gives them not only political freedom, that wasn't only the issue, but it's the spiritual freedom as well. And that is what's important. That even though we have the Hasmoneans are a secular, non-Davidic royalty, but they're preferred over Greeks. That seems to us to be a very clear thing. Now, it's a well-known question connected to Hanukkah. First of all, it's a 3-part question. Part number 1 is in Shas, in Torah Shebaal Peh, there's something called Masechet Megillah. And that's where we get all those stories about Esther and etc. How come there's no Masechet Chanukah? As a matter of fact, Hanukkah is only mentioned 7 times in all of Shas, and it's mentioned sort of like in passing. For instance, it was last week in the Daf. We're learning now in the Daf Baba Kama, which talks about damages. And so the storyline goes like this. If you light the candles outside your door and the animal is walking by and the animal kicks your menorah and it starts a fire. So that's how it mentions it, like not because of Hanukkah, but mentions it because of the damages. So why isn't it a larger issue, especially when you have Masechet Megillah? That's the first question. The second question is that the stress of Hanukkah is, and even here in Rambam, the stress of Hanukkah, when you say he discusses in source number 2, why are we celebrating Hanukkah? Even according to Rambam, what is the major issue? The oil, right. The oil was strengthening much more the idea of there wasn't enough oil and that oil burned for 8 days. Why isn't more of an emphasis on the military victory? That's the second thing. And the third thing is, where do we learn the history of the Hashmonaim from? We're learning the history of the Hashmonaim from a book called Sefer Maccabim. Now, Sefer Maccabim, listen, it was too late to be included in Tanakh. Tanakh was canonized earlier than that. But even so, why do we have Sefer Maccabim today? We have Sefer Maccabim today only because the Christians preserved it. In other words, the Hebrew translation that you have today is not the original Hebrew translation. They translated from Hebrew to Greek. We found the Greek copy, and today the translation that you have, that you read either in English or in Hebrew, is translated not from the original Hebrew, from the Greek. Well, actually, I should distinguish because there were two, there's Maccabim 1 and Maccabim 2. Maccabim 1 was written in Hebrew. Maccabim 2 was actually written in Greek to begin with. But why do we have it today? Not because we preserved it, which the Greeks preserved it. Which is true, by the way, of many of what we call the apocryphal literature in Hebrew called the Sifrei Chitzonim, those books that didn't make it into the canon. So based on these three questions, we sort of have to ask, why does Chazal not make a Masechet Chanukah? Why do we emphasize the Nes Pach HaShemen? And why was Sefer Maccabim not valued at that time period? Now, in order to answer this question, we need to go back in time. And we need to go back in time to source number 2. Source number 2 is the bracha that Yaakov gives to his sons before his death in Parshat Vayechi. And specifically the bracha that he gives, he says, first of all, let me just begin. Remember, he says to his sons, gather around and I'm going to tell you that which is going to happen at the end of days. And then he gives each son, was it a blessing? Was it not a blessing? You know, for Reuven, Shimon, right? He speaks to them very harshly. But by the time it comes to Yehuda, he says, Lo yasor shevet mi Yehuda, umechokek mi ben raglav, ad ki yavo Shilo v'lo yikahat amin. The scepter shall not depart from Yehuda, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, so that tribute shall come to him, and the homage of his people be his. Now, this English translation is what they had on Sefaria. I think it comes from JPS. And if you look at 2A, I also brought you Robert Alter's translation, which is pretty close, which seems to be the accepted translation of this verse. But without looking at the translation, you understand that we have problems here. What is the shevet? Lo yusor shevet, Yehuda, what does that word mean? Umechokek, problem with that words. Ki yavo Shilo, who or what or where is Shilo? Is it a person, a place, or a thing? And what does it mean that the congregation will come up to him? So I'm going to offer you today 3 different ways of understanding this with subcategories in each verse. And I'm actually going to take advantage of the board to help you keep it in order. So the first way of understanding this promise is that it's a...
Did you move the board to the middle so that they can see?
So that they can see.
You want help?
We can do that.
More on Zoom.
Right.
Is there anybody on Zoom?
You know,
Yes.
can you have a question before we go? Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is that this is a promise of eternal Davidic dynasty. Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda means exactly that the dynasty, the rulership, will always be with you. Now, the problem with that is, how do you deal then with periods of history when there was no king? So option number one is that although this is eternal, it's eternal, but not necessarily continuous. Okay, what does that mean? That is, let's take a look at that in source number 3. Source number 3 is a tshuva that was written by the Rashba. And the Rashba, we should really write this verse at the top. It says, Lo Yasur Shevet Yehuda Umechokeg Mibei Raglav Ad Ki Yaveh Shilo V'lo Ikahat. The Rashba is going to read the word ad as lo-ad. So that he reads, Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda, which this verse is in source number 2. You see it there? That's okay, no problem. Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda, the rulership will never leave Yehuda, Umechokek mibei raglav, and the person who makes the laws from between his children, la'ad. That's how the Rashba reads it, that it is eternal promise. And then he says, I'm in source number 3, Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda la'ad. You see, the rulership will never leave the tribe of Yehuda forever. Ki lebesof yavo Shiloh, because at the end, Shiloh is going to come. Who is Shiloh? Shehu mizaro, that he is from his children. V'tashiv alav hamlucha, and then the rulership will return to him. In other words, there will always be kings from Yehuda, but it doesn't necessarily be continuous, but it is forever. La'ad. That's how he reads it. He said, you did have other leaders. It's not saying that there's not going to be anybody else, but even if it stops, eventually it's going to come back. That is answer number 1. Now, the reason Rashba says this is because he's saying this for polemical reasons. Polemical Christians. The Christians came along and read this like this. There's always going to be a king of Yehuda until the arrival of Mashiach. No king of Yehuda, then Mashiach must have come. That's how the Christians read this verse. Okay? And you'll see why if you look at 2b, go back to 2b, Robert Alter, in his translation, he's talking about the word Shiloh. Okay? And he says in 2b, that the tribute to come to him. He's translating Shiloh as Shiloh, that the tribute comes to him. He says this is a notorious crux. What is a notorious crux? An unresolved question. It's a word that we don't know what it means. The Masoret text reads, until he comes to Shiloh, a dark phrase that has inspired much messianic interpretation. The present translation follows an exegetical tradition that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, which breaks up the word Shiloh into Shiloh. Now, that, by the way, comes from Rashi. If you look at source number 4, Rashi says, what is Shiloh? Shiloh refers to the King Messiah, to whom the kingdoms belongs. It's Shiloh, or so did Uncleus read it, until the Messiah comes, to whom the kingdom belongs. According to the Medrash Haggadah, Shiloh is a combination of Shai, Lo, a gift to him. They will bring a tribute to him, which is how it is translated. Now, stay with me here. Ready? Not only did the Christians want to say that this is a prophetic vision for the coming of Jesus, they said, look, we're going to find Jesus in the verse. Watch this. Why are you laughing? So watch. They said, look at that. Jesus' name is right there in the verse. It's got to be referring to Jesus. Yud, Shin, Vav, Yeshu.
Okay.
You know, Jews say, you want to play the game? Fine, we can play the game too. Watch. Lo, Yesh, Mum, Ra, Yeshu. Which means Lo, Yesh. If you take the breath, if you just want to take, Jews say, what do you mean? You can't just take 3 letters. You have to take the whole verse. And they say, if you read the verse, what's Lo, Yesh, Mum, Ra, Ki Yeshu, there is no blemish as bad as Jesus. So you want that to be Jesus? That's fine. But let's take it from the beginning. That's how polemics works. It's a cute. Or another Jewish concept was fine. Take Yeshu and then take these 4 letters, which spells Yita'im, which means we'll move them, we'll trick them, we'll fool them. Either way, once you start playing the letter game, it doesn't necessarily work out. But what it does tell you is that this really was a point of contention between Jews and Christians living in this time period. Is this a verse that does indicate the arrival of the Savior, as they are saying?
On Zoom, we can't really see writing.
Correct. The second explanation of is it an eternal dynasty is not that it's eternal, not continuous, but rather it refers to only when there is a monarch, then it has to be from David. It's referring to the fact that if there is a king, then he has to be from David. And this brings us to the crux of our matter in source number 5. Source number 5 is a very famous Ramban. And I've highlighted the important parts, but let's run through it. I'm on page 3. I'll explain, don't worry, don't be overwhelmed. Its matter is not that it should never depart. He says, the verse doesn't mean it's never going to depart. As it's written, the Lord will drive you out, and the king that has been sent over you to a nation unknown to you and your fathers. In other words, in Hazinu, it specifically says that you're going to go into exile. Now, does that mean, well, since God promised that there's always going to be a king, I can't send you into exile because there's no Jewish king in exile? No, Ramban says that can't be what the verse means. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if this is also polemical. He says, no, it doesn't say there's always going to be a king until Mashiach. He says, no, only if there is a king, then he has to be from Yehudah. And behold, according to that, they and their king are in exile, and they do not have a king and ministers. And for many days, there is no king in Israel. And the prophet did not promise Israel that they should not go into captivity in any way, so that Yehudah will reign over them, but rather, its matter is that the scepter should not depart from Yehudah to one of his brothers, since the monarchy of Israel that rules over them will be from him, from Yehudah, and none of the brothers will rule over him. And then he brings a whole bunch of proofs for that as well. Let's jump down, though, now to the next underline, because the next underline in the middle of the page, you see it in the middle of the page, says, and the matter of Saul. Because obviously that has to be the next question. If the verse says that the king always has to be from Yehudah, how do you deal with King Saul, who was from the tribe of Binyamin? So the Ramban says, and the matter of Saul, does anybody see where I am in the middle of the page? Okay, and the matter of Saul was that because the matter of the request for the monarchy at that time was disgusting for the Holy One, blessed be he did not want to crown someone from the tribe that has the monarchy that should never depart from it forever. When the Jews asked for the king to be like all the other nations of the world, it wasn't appropriate. And so therefore, because their request was inappropriate, God gave them a king who was inappropriate. And he gave them a temporary monarch. And the verse hints to this when it says in Hosea, I gave you a king in my ire, and I take him away in my wrath. As he gave him a king against his will, and therefore took him away in his wrath. As Shaul and his sons were killed, and the monarch was interrupted. Proof, he says, by the fact that the monarchy had no continuation. And all of this was because Shmuel was the judge and the prophet and the fighter of their wars, according to the mouth of God, and he delivered them from their enemies. So why did they need a king? Also, they should not have requested a king in his days, as he said to them, I'm at the next underlined, but the Lord your God is your king. You don't need a king, you have God. And the Holy One, blessed be, said to Shmuel, it is not you that they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king, and therefore he did not give them a lasting monarchy. And that which the verse states, you acted foolishly in not keeping the commandment of the Lord your God laid upon you. Otherwise, the Lord would have established your dynasty forever. See, which raises a second question. What would have happened if Saul had not sinned? Right, but the problem is that the kingdom has to come from Judah, and he's not from Judah. So does that mean that Saul didn't have free choice? So the Ramban gives two possibilities. He says, is that if Saul had not sinned, his seed would have had dominion over Israel, but not all of them, and that is the meaning to Israel. Maybe he would have reigned over the tribes of his mother, over Binyamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh, as Yehuda and Ephraim are considered like two nations, or he would have reigned under the hand of Yehuda. He says two possibilities. Maybe if Saul was righteous, he could have continued being king over a small group, or I like the second idea better, or he would have reigned under the hand of Yehuda, meaning he would have been like vice president. Right. He would have been vice president, which makes, that's like, okay. And according to my opinion, the kings from other tribes that ruled in Israel after David transgressed the will of the Father. You know that we have Saul, David, Shlomo, and then you have the kingdom is divided into the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, Malchut Yehuda, Malchut Yisrael. Ramban is holding that all those kings who were part of what we call the northern kingdom of Malchut Yisrael were sinners. And they were going a direct command. Now it's true the Navi had appointed Yeravam ben Nevat, but what Ramban is saying is after that one king, they should have come back and reunited. And by the fact that they didn't, they're transgressing the will of their father Yaakov and transferring their inheritance. And now now they should have gone back to the monarchy of Yehuda. They transgressed the will of the elder. Now go to the bold, because this is the key. This is where we're going with this. And that was the cause for the punishment of the Hasmoneans who reigned during the Second Temple, as they were otherwise lofty, pious ones. But for them, the Torah and the commandments would have been forgotten from Israel. But nonetheless, they were punished a great punishment. 4 of the sons of Matityahu the Hashmona'i, who reigned one after the other, in spite of all their strength and their success, fell to the hands of their enemies by sword. And in the end, the punishment reached it to that which the rabbis, may their memory blessed, said in Baba Batra. Anybody who says that I am from the Hasmonean dynasty is a slave. In other words, the entire Hasmonean dynasty was totally wiped out. There are no descendants alive today. What? Say it again?
What did you say?
Yeah, so let me explain what the Ramban is saying. What the Ramban is saying is that when there is a monarch, he has to be from the tribe of Yehuda, which means that you have Hasmoneans who are from which tribe? They're Kohanim. They became kings, and the Ramban says that was wrong, and that was I'm going to prove to you it's wrong, is that every single one of their descendants was totally wiped out. And there are no descendants alive today anymore from that family.
But they're punished because they made themselves leaders.
So that's correct.
On the other hand, they're looked upon as positive.
So that's exactly what I'm presenting to you here is a machloket between Rambam and Ramban. Rambam, as I pointed out to you at the very beginning, seems to view them in a very positive light, the right people in the right place who saved. And here the Ramban is saying what they did was wrong because they took the kingdom which should not have belonged to them. And then the Ramban takes it even a step further. He says, not only is the fact that they took the kingdom and they weren't from Yehudah, he says Kohanim have special jobs. Their job is to work in the temple. And they should not have taken on the political leadership. And so what the Ramban is really telling us here, I think, is two very important ideas. First of all, he very much believes in separation between church and state. Yeah, he's very much saying that. We have religious leaders, we have secular leaders, and the two should be separate because everybody has their own job, and it's a bad idea when you start conglomerating all the power under one person. The other thing he says is the ends do not justify the means. Because although he's willing to say that the Chashmonim were tzaddikim, and otherwise Torah and commandments would have been forgotten from Israel, he says that. He still doesn't see them as a positive force, and he has a very negative attitude towards the Hashmonaim because of this. And this perhaps could be the answer to why is there no Masechet Chanukah? Who put together Torah Shebaal Peh? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. What tribe is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi from? Yehuda. So as a descendant from Yehuda, he also views the Hasmoneans in a negative light and therefore does not create a Masechet for them. Therefore, they did not keep the book of Maccabim alive, and therefore we don't emphasize the military victory as much as we strive to talk about the spiritual light and etc. So that could answer our questions as well. The third approach that we have here is that his eternal Davidic dynasty is not necessary that it doesn't have to be continuous, or only when you have a monarch. Here, Rabbeinu Bachya says it only begins with Mashiach. That it's not that it's from the time of Yehuda all the way to Mashiach, that once Mashiach comes, then the monarchy is never going to leave him. And you have that in the Rabbeinu Bachya in source number 6, where he says, it follows that Yaakov's promise applied only to the periods in Jewish history when the whole Jewish people would be ruled over by a single king. If temporarily the Jewish people would be deprived of the conditions which call for a rule by king, in due course, when the proper conditions return, then the kingship would be returned to the tribe of Yehudah. Remember, in Second Temple, you don't have all of Israel. Remember, by the time you have Second Temple, the 10 tribes are already scattered. So therefore, he says this can't not apply to Second Temple. Therefore, Rabbeinu Bachya says the only time it applies is actually after the arrival of the Mashiach. And by the way, I'm going to skip it for lack of time, but if you go through source 6, you'll see he brings the same idea that he also believes that the Hasmoneans were wrong. And then this brings us to source number D. The last way of understanding this is we actually have to expand. What does a leader mean? What do I mean by that? This is approach that this verse is not referring only to a king, but is rather referring to any sort of leadership that we have. And if you look in source number 7, this is exactly what the Rashi tells us. Rashi tells us, the scepter shall not depart from Yehudah, from David and thereafter. These who bear the scepter after the termination of the kingdom are the exiles in Babylon, what we call the Reish Galuta, who ruled over the people with a scepter, and the students of the Lord, those are the students. What is this? What is Rashi saying? Rashi is basically saying that any leadership that you have after David, all of them in essence are actually descendants of King David. And the interesting thing is the Abar Benel says,
Any leader?
so this is what he says. So then I was thinking about it for a minute, and I realized 10 tribes are gone, right? The tribe of Benjamin was a very small tribe. So that the majority of you people sitting here today, we're all from Shevet Yehuda. Not most of us, except for those of you who know that you are Kohanim, right? So that statistically, you never thought about that, did you?
No.
But think about that. So statistically, the chance of having a leader from Yehuda is excellent because you don't really have anybody else.
So you have to, before you go into government, you have to see whether.
What they can chase their,
Genealogy.
you know, no, but like they used to make a big deal about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that he could track his lineage to Rashi, and Rashi was able to trace his lineage back to King David. But at a certain point, like I started thinking about it, I was like, a lot of us probably, had there not been a Holocaust, a lot of us probably could have done that as well, from Ashkenazic, lineage, right? Think about it for a minute.
That's what people use for Lubavitcher, also or Mashiach.
The Mashiachists, right,
Using that.
are using, but that's what I want to show you.
That's not-
So, but the way Rashi is explaining this sentence, as opposed to the first three that are saying that eternal divine existence is king, here Rashi and the Barbanel is saying, why limit it just to king? Because remember, Christians are saying no king, there must have been Messiah. So here Rashi is saying, no, as long as you have a Jewish leader, he's probably from Shevet Yehuda, which means that there has been a continuous leadership. And he specifically quotes the Reshe Galuta in Babylonia, who were, like Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who were descendants from David. So that is one. Explanation number two of understanding, how do we understand this verse, is that what we're saying is opposite of this. It's not that eternal. What we're really talking about is actually limited leadership. Why are you assuming that this is talking about eternal dynasty? According to these other opinions we're going to see, is Yaakov wasn't saying anything about eternal kingship. He was talking about a very specific time period in the world. And here we have a number of different opinions. The first opinion here is that we're actually only talking about the time period from Egypt till they entered the land. Who led the Jews in the Midbar? Moshe, which tribe was in the front of the column? Take a guess. No, they were around the Mishkan. Yehuda. That's right. It says in Bamidbar that Yehuda was the one. So Yehuda was the one who led them in the Midbar. When they came to Israel to capture Israel, who led the army in? Yehuda. Yeshua was then, but tribe of Yehuda. So that this explanation, which you have here in source number 8, essentially says that the control is going to be with Yehuda from leaving Egypt until they entered the land. And that's when the bracha ends. Option number 2 is what we have here in the Ibn Ezra, which you have in source number 9. Ibn Ezra tells us, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. The scepter of greatness shall not depart from Judah until David is inaugurated, the kingdom of Yehuda comes, and so it was. What is Ibn Ezra basically saying? That there's going to be kingdom in Yehuda until David. No. He says until David, then it's going to stop, and then it's going to come back again. But that's what he says. He says it refers only till the time up to David. Again, we're limiting this bracha. And he says, according to Ibn Ezra, it ends with that time. According to number C, which makes this one is going to make a lot of sense to you, that it stays with Yehuda until the division of the monarchy. Which was what? When did the monarchy divide? After Shlomo. Who divided the monarchy? Which prophet? What's the name of the prophet that divided the monarchy? His name is Achia ha-Shiloni. Until Shiloh comes, Achia Shiloni, and he divides the monarchy. And the Rashbam here in source number 10 tells us that not only that, but if you go to the underline, King Rechavam of Yehudah, the son of Shlomo, wanted to confirm his ascendancy onto the throne. What happened? Remember, he was going to be king. And then he says to his friends, should I tax the people or not tax the people? Remember the story? Okay, it doesn't matter. But Rechavam, the son of Shlomo, goes to the city of Shechem. And there he says to the people in Shechem, do you want me to be king? Shechem is very close to Shiloh. So the Rashbam says that's what it's referring to. But let's just take a look at the underline, because this underline, by the way, in the bottom of source 5 is censored. I had to find a number of Rashbams to find it inside, and you'll see why it was censored. I'll start at the beginning of the paragraph. There was an open space at Shechem around the famous oak located near Shechem. And at that location, a mass rally could be easily held. The people who pay homage to the sanctuary in Shiloh, the Mishkan was in Shiloh, from that vantage point, as it was in their line of vision. This exegesis refutes the view of the heretics, especially that of the Christians, who claim that Shiloh here is spelled with a hey at the end, and the city known as Shiloh is spelled with a vav. Right there, remember, Christians are saying that Shiloh is a person, and Rashbam is coming along and saying Shiloh is a city. That's right. He says that they're not the same. The one in our verse refers to the Savior, capital S, while the one in Shmuel is referring to a town. Yaakov, as opposed to the view of the Christians, did not elevate the position of Yehuda to be a savior beginning at that point in time, but rather he predicted that after the death of Shlomo, at the high point of Jewish history, a decline would set in, as documented by the 10 tribes, withdrawing from their support of a king from the tribe of Yehudah. So therefore, you have another reference there, and you see that how all the medieval commentators were familiar with what was going on in their world. The last explanation.
So when you bequeath something to your children, you have to be careful with the language.
That you have to use, oh yes. And finally, the last explanation in the saying that it's actually limited is an interesting one, and that's what I didn't bring it for Ibn Kaspi says. He says that, for instance, all we're referring to is First Temple. Remember, you have Malchut Beit David to the end of First Temple, and after that, it expired, so that it was a limited form of leadership. The last approach that we can take to all of this is to say that it's, first of all, it wasn't necessarily, you could say, first of all, that it's not necessarily a prophecy. What was it? Blessing. Sometimes blessings are fulfilled and sometimes they're not. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is you say also, the word king doesn't appear. Right? So you're saying it's not kingship at all. And then you don't even have a problem with trying to find out why there's no king at all. Those are basically the 3 different ways of understanding this verse. But what's important to me here is source number 12. Source number 12 is James Madison. James Madison, and you know that the forming fathers in America were very religious men.
Very religious.
Very
Some
religious.
of them knew Hebrew. And
Yes.
very-
And so he, in his Federalist Papers, he writes, and I think this is something we all know, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the hands of whether one, few, or many, whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. He knew that you have to have a division of power. And when you don't have division of power, you're setting yourself up for a lot of trouble. Which brings us to source 13, which I debated because Harvard is a bad word these days. But I figured since it was 1775, we could quote him, president of Harvard, who says like this: the Jewish government, according to the original Constitution, which was divinely established, was the perfect republic. The civil polity of Israel is doubtless an excellent general model. At least some principal laws and orders of it may be copied to great advantage in more modern establishments. And what is he referring to there? He's specifically referring to the division of, you have church state. Remember, the Navi always had the ability to speak to the king in ways that others didn't. And he said this really has to be the role model for us. So then now, this brings us all the way back to how are we able to apply this to today? And that takes us to source number 14. Source number 14 is the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Shimon says there are 3 crowns: the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of royalty. But the crown of a good name supersedes them all. So wait a minute, how many crowns are there?
4.
Okay, so single name.
1.
Source 15. Rabbi Shimon would say, he quotes them Avot again, there are 3 crowns: the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of kingship, and the crown of good name is greater than all of them. How does the crown of priesthood work? Even if someone paid all the silver and gold in the world, he could not give him the crown of priesthood. You know that joke? Guy comes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I'll give you $5,000 if you make me a Cohen. Rabbi says, I can't do it. All right, Rabbi, you're playing hardball. I'll give you $10,000. I don't care how much money you give me. I can't make a. All right, Rabbi, here's my last offer, $25,000. Why do you want to be a Cohen so much? That's a lot of money. Well, my father was, my grandfather was. Anyway, we could, no matter how much money he gives, the crown of priesthood, as it says, it will be for him and his descendants after him an eternal covenant of priesthood. For the crown of kingship as well. Even if someone paid all the silver and gold in the world, we could not give him the crown of kingship, as it says, my servant David shall be their prince for all time. But the crown of Torah is different. For anyone who wishes to partake in the work of Torah may come and partake. As it says, ho, all who are thirsty, go to the water. That is, go and labor in the words of Torah. Do not occupy yourself with meaningless things. And that is what is going to bring the Keter Shem Tov, which is supposed to be a direct, comes directly out from that last idea. Now, let's go back in the last minute I have to your picture on the front of your page. The picture in front of your page is a coin that comes from the Hasmonean era. The coin has 2 sides. On the right side is ancient Hebrew, and it says Yonatan Kohen Gadol. Look at this one. It's ancient Hebrew. You have to know how to read ancient Hebrew. On the left side is Greek, and it says Alexander King. What does that prove? Same coin, 2 sides. It wasn't as much, that's the same person. Yonatan is Alexander. Alexander is his English name. Yonatan is his Hebrew name. And for the Jews, he presented himself in Hebrew as Yonatan Kohen Gadol. But in his secular position, he writes in Greek, and he uses his secular name, Alexander the King, which indicates that what the Ramban was saying, that the one family took all the power to them. And so that's what I think you sort of have to say is that the Chazal looked at the Hasmoneans in a negative way because of the combination of power. And therefore, we celebrate the Nes Pachashemen. And we have no Masechet because we're not necessarily celebrating the Hasmoneans because of their involvement, perhaps things that should not have gone their way. But they have Hasmoneans. They have all of the communities in that area. There's Lapid, Hashmonaim, Oranim, Beit Hashmonai. All of those are names connected to the Hanukkah story because that's where the war with Yehuda Maccabim happened in Emaus.
But would you call them secular?
Yes, the Hasmoneim became secular.
Became.
They started very religious, and then it was downhill from there.
Okay.
Of all the kings that came, they all really come from Kingship? No.
Which in the southern kingdom, what we call Malchut Beit David, they were all Beit David, son after son, sometimes a brother. In Malchut Yehuda, none of them were. They were all, from other places.
It's not like pure blood.
On that side there was. On the David side there was.
Wow. Very interesting.
Which is another thing, is that remember that the Hasmoneans also have a queen. Shlom Tzion. The Hasmoneans had a queen. They had a queen. Her name is Shlom Tzion HaMalka, King Salome. She is a descendant of the Hasmoneans, and she had rabbinic, her brother was Shimon ben Shetach, and she ruled, and she had rabbinic, because the rabbi said, better we should have some female who was appropriate than somebody who's not, and she ruled with rabbinic authority. From Zion. That's a whole different saga.
Thank you. So we don't have class.
So there's no class next week. No class next week. And the week after that, we're going to talk about, did Potiphar believe his wife? Mrs. Potiphar makes this whole story up, right?
Yeah.
Did her husband believe her?
Your husband what?
Believe her.
Well, he must have, because he put him,
Yeah.
he was such in jail.
Why did he kill her? That's right. Why? Why doesn't he kill him?
Is this a conversation?
And I don't know if she specifically dug up, but when I said to her that I'm speaking about this, I don't want to make sure. Because sometimes, how do I say this? Sometimes what Chazal say it's not necessarily what historians say. So I wanted to make sure that I was on track. So that's what she said.
This will keep you graduating.
As it is.
Right, I know, like, it's like, no.
I didn't know they existed.
I think there's an attitude that says you have to do what you have to do today.
Right.
You have to remember what's going on, but you still have to do it.
I mean, I'll still give them
Oh, yes.
the